Okay, I'm going to call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Policy and Strategic Priorities to order. Madam Clerk, may we have the roll call, please?
Councillor Reimer in the chair. Mayor Roberts. Councillor Louie. Councillor Stevenson, not in the chamber at this time. Councillor Deal. Councillor Jang. Councillor Meggs, not in the chamber at this time. Councillor Ball, not in the chamber at this time. Councillor Carr. Councillor Affleck. Councillor DeGenova, not in the chamber at this time. You have quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. I did want to start by acknowledging that we are in the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Also, before we there's two items on the agenda. Both of them have either a presentation or speakers. However, mindful of some of the process issues yesterday, I did want to run through the rules one more time, just so it doesn't come as a surprise when I seek to enforce them if we do that today. Procedure bylaw is the set of rules that we use, and the Vancouver Charter. In the event that they are silent on a matter, it reverts to Robert's Rules of Order. My role is to ensure that Council conducts the business on the agenda while ensuring there is both procedural fairness for everyone, the speakers, the Council members, the staff, and maintaining the integrity of the process such that it is defensible in a court of law. At the same time, the rules are not meant to strangle the process but enable it, so from time to time there may be ways to use the process to ensure the fairest process outcome, which includes trying to use time wisely, because wasting time of staff, members of the public, or council with business that is not properly before us is not a fair process. So a couple of rules I wanted to point to in particular that we seemed to have trouble with yesterday. On the who is talking front, if the chair is talking, nobody else is talking. The chair would recognize one councillor to speak, and that would be the one councillor who is speaking. If there is a point of order, and I'm sorry one in particular isn't here to hear this, but for the rest of your knowledge, it includes a one-sentence point of order that points to the rule in the procedure bylaw that has been violated. At that point, I will rule on the point of order. The only other thing that a councillor may say at that point is I challenge the chair. At that point, there is no debate. I clarify what the challenge is. We need a 2/3 majority of council to vote to overrule the chair. If points of order are being used to obstruct the meeting, I will call a recess until cooler heads prevail. Questions. The procedure bylaw requires you to simply state a question, which shouldn't take more than a few sentences. There's two items on the agenda today, one on sea level rise, one on public toilets. If the subject of marijuana comes up, I will ask us to get back to the subject matter at hand or call a recess. Finally, logistics, just because it's come up before, for the purposes of meeting time, the clock in front of us is the clock that I am relying on. For the purposes of speaking time, the clock in front of you on your computer is the one that I am relying on. I know we know what quorum is, but just a reminder, there needs to be 6 people, including the chair, in the chamber at all time. On the matter of extension, I will call an extension. If it is past 12, please flag me and I will deal with it. And very last rule, in committee we do not stand, so you need not, in fact should not be standing when you are speaking unless you have a medical condition which requires you to stand throughout the meeting. Okay, so with that, we are off to the races, hopefully, with a calm and orderly and productive meeting today. So I'm going to ask Gil Kelly, who is going to present on, or open up the presentation at least, on preparing for sea level rise next steps. Welcome, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Council and Mayor. I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to introduce this item that Doug and Tamsin and the whole sustainability group have been working on for some time now. In advance of my arrival, I'm just very happy to see how thoughtful their approach has been on this. I come from a recent experience in San Francisco where we paid a lot of attention, and I personally led an effort there to prepare that city for sea level rise, which is an ongoing activity. And I guess I would just note that the ongoing nature of this is very important to stress. One, because we're understanding more about the unfolding science of sea level rise and climate change generally, and that predictions will unavoidably be revised as we go forward in the future. So a big part of the effort here is both understanding the evolving nature of the science and the conditions, and also being careful that the solutions we point to are actually adaptable, so that it's not as if we can set an end year at 2100 and then sea level rise stops and we're all good. So it's a difficult a piece for a lot of people to get their minds around. And so I think a big part of what you'll hear very shortly in the presentation is the need to educate as we get out in public. And so the consultation that's going forward will need to not be characterized as we've got 3 solutions, pick one, but let's continue to all get smart about the whole phenomenon of sea level rise and understand a range of possible design solutions, all of which will need to get revisited as time goes on. So with that introduction, I just again wanted to thank the staff that I've been very fortunate to inherit who are working on this, and I'll just turn it directly over to Tamsin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Just before you start, Ms. Mills, I did want to recognize, I forgot to do it, that today is Take Your Kids to Work Day, I think in the province of British Columbia, at least in the city of Vancouver. Wanted to welcome all the grade 9 students who are here as part of that program. So welcome. We are going to be very well behaved today, as you heard. Okay, Ms. Mills.
Thank you very much. So good morning, Mayor and Council. This morning I am presenting an update to our climate change adaptation strategy and specifically preparing for sea level rise. Before I get started, I'd just like to introduce some members of our great consulting team that we had working on this. Tamsin Lyle from Ebwater Consulting and Graham Long from Compass Resource Management. NHC and Urban Systems were also part of the group. So this morning I'll go over a bit of background and context and then jump into our coastal flood risk assessment, which has been our project since 2012. And we'll really focus today on phase 2, which was looking at response options in the coastline areas of Vancouver, and then touch on next steps and recommendations. Vancouver is a leader in climate change mitigation, so decreasing our greenhouse gases through actions such as facilitating active transportation, energy requirements for buildings, and landfill capture. But despite local efforts, global greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. And with this, the extent of climate change that we may experience and the impacts from climate change. We've seen many impacts already in Canada. 2013 was a bad year with the Calgary floods and the Toronto floods, which cost Canadian insurers $3.2 billion. Of course, the impacts are being seen around the world. And just this year, the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy published their report where they found that direct economic losses to the Lower Mainland region due to river and coastal floods could exceed $30 billion by 2100. And the province published a cost of adaptation report a few years ago with an estimate of about $10 billion for flood management preparation in the Lower Mainland. So we need to start planning now and be proactive. We started our work in 2012 with adoption of the climate change adaptation strategy, and we looked at impacts to the city from increased heat days, rainfall intensity, storms, and of course, sea level rise. The actions in the plan for sea level rise include completing a coastal flood risk assessment and developing citywide sea level rise response plan. And that's what the update focuses on today. At the initiation of the work, our steering committee came up with some guiding principles, and a few of those are listed here. So using the best available science and practicing adaptive management. Of course, the science is always evolving, so we need to be nimble and ready for new science. Seek adaptable and green solutions as possible and phase over time. So perhaps we don't build the solution for 2200 today, but we get ready to phase over time. Seek no regret actions, so those that benefit livability of Vancouver regardless of climate change. Pursue funding strategies based on value and equity. Take a risk-based approach, so thinking about those consequences and likelihood, and be resilient by providing redundancy. So a quick review of causes of sea level rise. Many of the warmest years on record have occurred since 2000, and 90% of that new excess heat is stored in the oceans, which causes thermal expansion and sea level rise. As well, we have melting of land ice through glaciers and ice sheets. Recently, lots of focus on Greenland. Sea level rise is not a possible or a probable, but a question of when. The amounts are unpredictable. We have the BC government curve shown here, published in 2011. The gray range, that's the range envelope from low to high estimates, and BC has put forward the number of 1 meter by 2100 and 2 meters by 2200. But of course, sea level rise may not follow this smooth curve. A recent visit from American scientists suggested that we'd see 20 to 30 centimeters by mid-century, and then following that, it's really a bit unpredictable. It's unstoppable and irreversible given the heat that exists already. But the good news is, if we are proactive, it's slow, and if we think big enough and flexible enough, we can prepare. So just some reminders of some recent flooding in Vancouver during king tide events, so the highest tides of the year that occur between November and February. Coincidental with storms, so here's the Jericho Pier, Jericho Park, and the sandbagging effort on Northwest Marine Drive. Pictures of the seawall from the West End and False Creek, and of course every year we have reparations following king tides to the seawall. As well, since 2012, there's been a lot more focus on flood management and climate change adaptation from the regional to the federal level. So the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy is coordinated by the Fraser Basin Council with 46 members, including all of the Metro Vancouver municipalities. The province is amending their flood hazard management guidelines, and Vancouver staff have provided input to that, and the federal government has some new programs focusing on flood management. So our coastal flood risk assessment is a project that we started in 2012. We did update council in 2014 on the first phase. So the first phase of work really looked at where can it get wet and what's in the way. So we used a range of current and future scenarios to look at where the flood extents could be. In 2014, one of the outputs was to raise our flood construction level, or the minimum elevation for habitable space in a building, from 3.5 meters to 4.6 meters. And many municipalities have followed suit in the Lower Mainland. And the focus of today is phase 2, which really looked at what can we do in these areas. So really developing preliminary response options for 11 areas of the city coastline. So just a quick review of phase 1. Some of the outputs were flood mapping that showed the extent and depth of mapping today, mid-century, and towards the end of the century, given various flood scenarios. There are limited areas of the city that are at risk of flooding today, but when we add sea level rise to the equation, our risk grows toward the end of the century. We also looked at what's in the way, so looking at infrastructure and populations vulnerable over time to different flood extents. And one of the outputs of phase 1 was raising that flood construction level. So this morning, the focus is on phase 2, where we started to look at what sorts of approaches can be taken in various areas of the city. And sort of the objectives were threefold. So one, in those areas where we have shorter term flood risk, what are some reasonable approaches? Two, in those areas with longer term risk, how can we preserve the options to ensure that we have the ability to implement them in the future? And third was to start discussion publicly on what can be done. So the process we followed was to generate a range of options, quite a long list, looking at what's being done internationally and expert judgment. And then we defined evaluation criteria and compared the approaches against these criteria to get into the trade-offs, so to really look at what the differences are between the approaches. We worked with a range of city staff as well as external stakeholders through workshops. And we really focused on these 3 commonly recognized approach buckets or categories: adapt or accommodate, protect, and retreat. So adapting involves raising city infrastructure, raising buildings, implementing resilient flood construction, those sorts of things. Protecting is keeping the water out. So whether using more traditional dike infrastructure or green shores approach with natural berms, etc. And retreating is removing buildings and infrastructure over time and rehabilitating the area. In comparing the approaches, we had a whole range of considerations that fell into the categories of people, environment, economy, and implementation. So examples of the considerations were number of people impacted, number of people displaced, potential for hazardous materials spills, impacts to the environment from the flood management intervention, number of employees and businesses at risk, the cost, ease, and adaptability of implementation. So it was many evaluation considerations. Of course, it's very important to consider when an option should be implemented in a certain area. We don't want to implement too early and have unnecessary maintenance dollars before the infrastructure is needed, and we don't want to miss protective benefits. So our consulting team came up with graphs in each area of the city with specific assets looked at. So this is an example of one of the graphs from the waterfront road area near the C-bus. So the blue line, or number 1 on the graph, is a low point of waterfront road. The green line, or number 2, is the Crab Park waterfront. And the brown line is a pump station on Water Street. So the horizontal axis is time, with 2050 in about the middle and 2100 on the right side. And the vertical axis is the annual probability of flooding. So the area at the bottom of the graph are very rare flood events. But the area at the top of the graph are your more common flood events, with the annual king tide at the very top of the graph. So what this is telling us is if we look at 2016, the low point on Waterfront Road is at risk of a common flood event today. Whereas Crab Park Waterfront moves into sort of the common flooding risk by mid-century, and the pump station is pretty resilient to the end of the century. So we've done this for assets in all the coastline areas of Vancouver, and this helps us prioritize where we need attention now. I wanted to give a few examples. We are, of course, as Gil mentioned, not the only city planning for sea level rise and preparing currently. Here's an example from New York City, the Dry Line project, where they're proposing raising public infrastructure and public space over time to provide protection. Here's an example from Rotterdam. So you have a river scenario with a seawall that can provide protection during temporary flood events, and then this bermed area of the park to provide longer protection. An example of a dike that's still providing access to a river. And here's more of an urban seawall landscape where the lower levels can be flooded in the near term and maybe lost in the longer term, but you have this upper area that's usable. So now I'm going to shift gears and start talking about some of the preliminary approaches that were looked at through the study. These are the 5 focus areas that I'll go through first. So False Creek, Fraser River Industrial, Southlands, the Jericho-Locarno area, and Kitsilano. So in False Creek, 3 approaches: protecting with a sea barrier, protecting by raising the seawall, and adapting. So a sea barrier, this would go near the narrows of False Creek, somewhere near the Burrard Street Bridge. It would be closed 3 to 4 days a year, sort of when it's built towards the end of the century. And of course, those closures would increase over time. Benefit is that it's one piece of infrastructure with limited impacts to public space or private buildings. It would need a lot of maintenance given the moving parts, and we'd have to build it to a certain level, so the amount of adaptability is questionable. Certainly in Rotterdam, anecdotally, they built one of these in 1980 with 20 centimeters of sea level rise projected, and I'm sure they wish they had incorporated more. So here's just an example. The Thames Barrier, of course, is one of these, and here's another example from the Netherlands. So another approach that we looked at was raising the existing seawall. So this would need to be raised an average of 2.3 meters over the next 90 years. Benefit is that this could be phased implementation with development and asset renewal over time. There's no moving parts and could provide improvements to the public realm. Negatives are that there'd be view impacts to neighboring buildings, access to the water could be impaired, and in many parts of the seawall there's some space constraints to make this happen. The third approach looked at was adapting with planning tools, and really through our work we discovered that this is an excellent complementary measure. This is good best practices regardless. It's good to mention that the province does require raising buildings to flood construction levels regardless of whether it's behind a dike or not. So here's an example from New York City. Post-Superstorm Sandy, they created a design guideline on how to retrofit buildings. So here they're taking residential off the first floor and putting commercial instead. They're floodproofing or filling some of the basement, moving the mechanical area out of there. And they have some deployable flood shields and temporary stairs for during flood events. Another example from Europe, you're starting to see more of these floodgates, so in preparation for a flood, a gate would come out across the doors. These floodgates can also come up in streets to protect the street area. So moving on to Fraser River Industrial, this is the area from Angus Drive in the west to Boundary Road in the east. We looked at protecting with a shoreline dike, an inland dike, and adapting. So shoreline dike, this would be a dike along the shoreline. We have examples of this in neighboring municipalities such as Richmond. So it does provide for co-benefits with improved amenities such as paths. There is no current City of Vancouver right-of-way here, and the feasibility is dependent on soils given the seismic standards required by the province. The inland dike option was looked at given that City of Vancouver has a right-of-way on East Kent Avenue. So this would include raising the street to provide some protection. The soils could be potentially better here, but of course this would not protect the shorewood properties and would be difficult to tie into existing infrastructure. And adapting, again, a good complementary measure, so examples of flood vents to reduce pressure during a flood and flood-proof storefronts. Southlands neighborhood, we did work with the Musqueam on the flood hazard mapping and hope to collaborate with them on approaches going forward. Protect with a dike, adapting with multiple tools, and managed retreat were looked at in this area. So protecting with a dike, this would be about 6.5 kilometers of dike. It would involve raising the existing trail 1.3 meters to 3 meters. City does have a right-of-way here, could provide public amenity and improve public space. It would have very heavy drainage requirements. The technical feasibility, of course, needs to be looked at, and there would be impacts to neighboring properties as the picture below shows. Managed retreat, so this is removing, buying out homes and infrastructure over time. This is obviously a very adaptable strategy. There's a lot of opportunity for whatever range of sea level rise occurs and for habitat and recreation gains. The negatives are that it's permanently displacing a neighborhood, and eventually this would result in loss of land. And again, the adapting with multiple tools, so there's some temporary flood barriers shown that are good interim measure, and some interesting architecture from Squamish. So the Jericho-Locarno area, we looked at putting a dike somewhere in the park, using the road as the dike, adapting or retreating. So if we're talking about a park dike, this is about 2 kilometers of dike needed, raising the established trail by about 1.8 meters over time. Lots of opportunity to provide co-benefits here and do something interesting in the park. There's lots of space. It's very adaptable. By putting a dike in the park, as the beach and tidal area moves in, you'd have a bit of a seawall feel, which could impact the aesthetics. Protecting with a road dike, this would be raising the road about 1.7 meters for about 2 kilometers. This would allow more natural migration of the beach and tide area, and it's economical, but of course, over time you would lose the destination park area and difficulty tying into existing infrastructure. Retreat was again looked at here with the same sort of benefits and costs. And adapt again. In Jericho, we went a bit further and had a workshop with park board staff looking at examples from elsewhere, Europe and New Jersey on this example, of how you can build sort of a resilient park area where you add berms in certain areas, and other areas you're allowing the water to come in. And here's an example from one of the park board staff, letting water in one area, building up the others to try and create sort of a resilient park. So moving forward here, we'll work with the First Nations with key interests in this area. Kitsilano, similar options, protecting with a dike in the park, protecting by using the roadways or adapting. So the park dike, again, this would be about 700 meters, raising the trail an average of 1.4 meters. The road dike, that would be raising 600 meters of Arbutus and Cornwall, with obvious difficulties tying into existing infrastructure, and adapting with multiple tools. So that's it for the focus areas. We did, in 2015 dollars, look at high-level cost estimates for the different options. There's a lot of caveats on the ranges here, depending on whether soil densification is required or land purchase. So these are Class D high-level cost estimates, but they help us start the conversation. So I'm just going to touch on the secondary focus areas briefly. These were secondary because either the Vancouver is a secondary jurisdiction in these areas, the risk is much further out time-wise, and or there's only sort of one option that makes sense. So Cole Harbour, really the response options involve dealing with the seawall. The waterfront road area, this is a picture from 2012 near the Seabus terminal. That's the port's parking lot, and it was centimeters from flooding. So we've been working with the port in this area, as well as with TransLink and other stakeholders in the area. New Brighton Park, some options there, and Stanley Park, looking at dealing with the seawall over time. In the near term, there's some vulnerable infrastructure at Sunset Beach and Second Beach, but by mid-century, we should start thinking about the causeway and the seawall. Point Grey Road, this isn't at flood risk given the elevation, but certainly erosion risk over time. So some of our conclusions to the phase 2 work is that it's important to protect land regardless of use. So replacing a destination park like Jericho somewhere else in the city is considered very difficult, and so we should protect parkland as well. Prioritize maintaining natural shoreline for as long as possible and incorporating green solutions. Looking for co-benefits, so enhancing amenities where possible, and phasing solutions over time. This gives us an opportunity to build now for a certain timeline, and as we get more information and technology changes, perhaps we course correct towards the end of the century. We broke next steps down into immediate next steps, and then short term out to 2020, 2030, medium term to mid-century, and long term. So immediate next steps. We'd like to begin our short-term projects in the Jericho-Locarno area, Fraser River area, and the Waterfront Road area. Continue our work with other levels of government through the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy and working with First Nations, and begin some engagement. So in sort of two areas, one being broad citywide engagement, starting with education to build awareness and understanding, and then more deep conversations at the project level, so the project level being the different areas. So broad community-wide education, really looking at the causes and impacts of sea level rise, some of these preliminary options, what to expect in Vancouver, and then doing a deeper dive as we start those neighborhood projects in terms of what do you think of these preliminary approaches, what approaches have we missed, and at the same time looking at the technical feasibility of the different approaches. Other immediate next steps include developing flood warnings and flood response plans, developing an adaptive management strategy and starting monitoring so that we have those decision thresholds ready to go so we can monitor when to start different projects. And of course, preserving future options, so sharing this information with all the redevelopment projects and planning projects occurring around the coastline. In terms of financial considerations, funding sources include all levels of government. We've taken a preliminary look at tools at the regional and local scale. And really, our next step is to start planning now for long-term funding, and as these area-specific projects go forward, to take a closer look with a complete funding strategy. So to close, our recommendation is to begin broad community education concurrent with the King Tide season this year, starting in November. Initiate short-term projects by 2017. So that would be in areas such as along the Fraser River and Jericho-Locarno. That would include concurrent engagement as well as refining the engineering feasibility. In parallel, I would like to develop a sea level rise response strategy to outline the medium and long-term actions. So making distinct decisions on what option to pursue in some of these longer-term areas might not make sense today. There'll be a lot more information and evolution to mid-century, but we want to know when those threshold dates are so that we can monitor and be ready with project teams, roles and responsibilities, as well as ideas on project funding. So thank you. That was a lot of information. We're open to questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mills. You do have quite a few people with questions, so I'll start with the first person, which is Mayor Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to you and the whole team for all the work done on this. I know it's a huge undertaking. Lots of work went into this, and no doubt there are lessons to learn from other cities who are working on this actively right now, and a few who have a jump on it due to their geography. But I know a lot of this work has been breaking trail, and the team that's worked on this I think has done great work to figure out these next steps and get a really good assessment together of what we're facing here. So big appreciation for all of that. I'm curious how much work you've done and can summarize right now around timelines involved for the construction of the protection and protect and adapt strategies, which from my perspective, it's hard to imagine a managed retreat given the value of land and the scarcity of land that we have here in Metro Vancouver. I'm assuming we're going to be looking at protect and adapt almost all the time. But how long to build some of these facilities? Is it yes, there's a longer timeline with the rise of the oceans, how long it takes to build the structures and transform the waterfront areas is what I'm curious, how much study you've done on that front.
Yeah, thank you for that question. We did look at timelines in the report. So we looked at not only the amount of time it might take to construct, but also the lag time to have decision-making process and funding strategies in place. So the report does sort of recommend some threshold dates when we would need to start in different areas given our understanding of the rate of sea level rise today. And then this next step of an adaptive management strategy would help us with monitoring to be sure that we're ready and recognize the triggers to start way back from the date we need the piece of infrastructure, say, in place. So we have that lag time looked at even more closely.
Okay, and at this point, given the projections that exist for sea level rise, that's factored into your time horizons around immediate and short, medium, and long-term actions?
Yes, correct. So based on today's projections of sea level rise, we have timelines on when we need to start prioritizing different areas, incorporating that lag time of construction and decision making.
And in terms of the assessment of the damages, if there are, when we've seen these king tide events in particular, where there's been significant damage done, we assume the intensity and frequency of those events is increasing. The cost benefit analysis of investing in infrastructure sooner than later, did you do much work around that? At what point it's worth it to start taking on raising the seawall or building dikes and at Kitts or Locarno Beach?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did a preliminary look at that to help us with the preliminary timelines, and with the adaptive management strategy, which is the next step, we need to look at risk tolerance. So when does sort of the nuisance flooding become intolerable, and that fine line, and we tip over to wanting that piece of infrastructure?
Okay, so that's still work that needs to be done to really assess whether it is more urgent due to the impacts.
Yes, to take a closer look at that, that's the next step.
Okay. Can you just describe a bit the work, as you know, that's taking place around the region? Obviously, if we can deal with some of these areas that are strictly within the city of Vancouver, but we're hugely affected by what happens around the region. That $10 billion study, the cost of flooding in the region was a few years ago now, but I'm not clear on exactly what's been updated or what work's happening.
Yeah, no problem. So the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy, which is coordinated through the Fraser Basin Council, includes members from Hope to Lions Bay. And we've all been participating in what steps that large project should take. So what has been done to date, finished this year in May of 2016, was their vulnerability and risk assessment. So they're really following many of the steps that we've done, but at the regional scale and a few years behind. So they looked at, obviously, where the regional risks and vulnerabilities were, and they did some flood modeling as well to give some numbers on flood construction levels and such. They're just about to embark on phase 2 of their work, which is looking at what can be done. So refining their risk assessment numbers, but also looking at where is the greatest risk in the region. So as you've pointed out, if a highway is cut off in Surrey, then that has implications for all of us, the airport, our rail lines. So starting to look at where to prioritize regional work and what are the options that could be pursued.
Okay,
Mayor Robertson, you're out of time.
Okay, I don't have anything that says what the time is.
Oh, I have you at 5:25. Okay. Councillor Deal.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Let's cut the mayor off. Some of my questions have to do, there's a lot of material here, and I think that we're going to be asking about a lot of aspects of this. I'm going to focus on a couple of things around sort of more of the ecosystem side of things, because that's where my background is. So when I used to work in fisheries, we used to talk about safe fail versus fail safe, which means that we know it's going to flood, so how do we manage that? So that's that adaptation piece. I'm interested in a couple of aspects of this. First of all, I know there's some best management practice around the world, perhaps Copenhagen and some other very low-lying cities. Maybe a little bit more about what they're doing in the realm of allowing it to flood and allowing it to flood in a way that has a minimal impact on structures and human lives. But I'm also interested in the impact on ecosystems in the region. So could you talk a little bit about the peak flood versus the ongoing sea rise? And those are very different scenarios. One is high energy impact on shorelines, and slope stability is a really important facet of that, dike stability. And the other one is just that creeping rise. And those might require different approaches. I'm wondering how we're sort of coordinating those two. And I'm also interested in some of the differences between the river rising and the ocean rise, which I think are, again, those sort of different scenarios.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll start with the river versus the ocean. So in the Vancouver stretch of the Fraser River, the limiting factor is a winter storm and storm surge, so more the ocean factor than the river freshet in the Vancouver reach of the Fraser River. And then in terms of best management practices and the ecosystem impacts, certainly there's been a lot of work done by West Coast Environmental Law and others looking at the environmental impacts of flooding and the green shores approach and what we can do with more naturalized shoreline and what we can do to improve habitat. So while these were presented as sort of mutually exclusive approaches, of course, each one can be improved by doing things such as improving habitat, looking at more closely at the ecosystem impacts and what we can do. And then I think your other question was about the peak flood versus sort of sea level rise, and that's a very good differentiation. We will have those flood events at high tide during a really bad storm, and those are temporary flood events versus sea level rise, which over time will cause permanent inundation of some areas. So that definitely affects how we look at different approaches, and as well the mention of the adaptive management strategy and looking at risk tolerance, how much flooding do we tolerate in these events, and when do we need to take action, and what can we do? And of course, ecosystems provide a lot of options and protective benefits in and of themselves, and the project down at New Brighton Park, so adding marsh down there is a helpful resilience tactic as well.
Right. I'm wondering if there's some opportunities where instead of having straight line diked or raised roads or pathways inland of the actual current shoreline, some opportunities to actually allow some old ravines or creeks that were there in the past to be opened up as maybe it's on a road now, and that's something that has to be considered a long-term consideration, is whether to allow water to continue up paths that used to take into the inroad areas or inland areas of the Lower Mainland.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration as we look at the approaches more closely, is where are there opportunities to sort of let the water in, and also on the flip side of that, thinking about where the water may come up some of our pipes and infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the regional approach, I sit on Fraser Basin Council as the Metrovan rep, and we're talking about the flood. In fact, I'm having a meeting this afternoon about it. I'm interested in how we're looking at regional sensitive ecosystems in terms of flooding and the biodiversity of our estuaries, for instance.
That's actually one of the projects that they've put on the work plan for phase 2, is taking a much closer look at the environmental impacts and possible adaptations as well. and putting together a committee focused on advising on that in the region.
Okay, and I would assume that the agricultural land reserve and all of our farmland would come into that consideration as well in terms of vulnerable land that's really important to humans as well as animals and plants.
Yeah, that was a focus of the vulnerability study. They specifically looked at agricultural land as well.
So food security would fit into this as well.
Very important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Deal. Councillor Meigs.
Thanks for this report. I live in False Creek, so I'll try not to ask too many questions about that. But further to Mary Robertson's comment, I mean, I think that one of the advantages the city may have in certain locations is that if it owns the land, it has a wider range of options as to whether or not it lets go or adapts or defends and so forth, which may not be there for private property. Will be expectation, I assume, from private owners is that we'll spend whatever it takes to avoid them from being flooded. Is that a fair point? I mean, I just think that, you know, we can say in the case of city land that we have a range of options based on our judgment about costs and impacts and so forth, and it's up to us to make that decision on behalf of the public. But I think the public, by and large, has an expectation that they will somehow be safeguarded entirely from flooding. Is that a concern you have?
Yeah, I think that's a concern. I think that part of the broad education is about the impacts of sea level rise and what some of the possible approaches are, and the conversations that we have on the project area specific projects in areas that are flood prone are, how do we pay for this? How do we approach this? What are the best options? What have we missed?
I mean, to that end, I'll move to the Fraser River area, which you identified as kind of a short-term issue. I mean, right adjacent to the Musqueam Reserve, there's a very expensive subdivision of single-family homes built on a spit in the Fraser River, about 3 or 4 feet above. I mean, to me, that's one of those tough policy questions where you can't really ring the entire subdivision with a dike without colossal cost, and I can see problems arising. So rather than focus on those individuals, I'd just like to ask about the regional aspect of it, because the Fraser, as you've said, is more of an ocean conditions issue than a freshet problem. But I still worry about the regional and provincial approaches to this, because if we do a good job on our stretch, we could still have flooding surge around from Burnaby, couldn't we?
Absolutely.
Not to stigmatize Burnaby, but
This has to be a coordinated effort along the Fraser, most definitely. And in Burrard Inlet, we have to work with our neighbors, and we are doing that through the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy and other ad hoc groups to look at how we can work together.
well, I think, is the province requiring that kind of coordination or just telling us all to change our building code?
The province is involved in the coordination, but certainly not requiring it.
Yeah, so I look for further upstream, and again, this may not be the case because it'd be more of a freshet thing, but historically, the Fraser River had all kinds of sponges in it, a much larger Burns Bog, but all of Sardis Prairie was wetland. And the hardening of the river, both by training walls and dredging and a whole set of other factors, has made it easier for commerce, but probably, you know, so farming in the valley and so on, but made it much more likely that a significant combination of events could cause flooding, in my opinion. Is there any thought to a regional approach in that respect that would go to municipalities? This is tough stuff, but say, you know what, we may need you to make decisions to let go and recreate wetlands because it'll have a long-term benefit to the wider region. I mean, those discussions seem to me to be relevant, not just will Burnaby build a dike, but also will we take steps regionally that could increase our resilience?
I think the work that's being coordinated by the Fraser Basin Council is a very preliminary step in that direction, but certainly those conversations are not being had.
Okay, well, I think it'd be useful to have recommendations from staff at some point about recommendations this council could make to the UBCM and to senior levels of government in that regard, because I think our taxpayers are going to say, well, it's all very well to you know, throw a dike up higher on the Fraser River, but if it's a useless dike, why would we do that? And I think that we're going to get the bill, we're going to be invited to share the bill to harden up YVR, for example, which based on your report and all of the other factors is probably, I mean, we had some discussion about this at our last council meeting, and I know that YVR is alive to this problem, but it's not going to be solved with transportation fees imposed on passengers, I don't think.
Councillor Meigs, I don't think that technically counted as a question, so I would understand if there were no answer to it.
Well, yeah, just take it as an indication from me at least that I would value some of those recommendations, because I guess, you know, I'll put the question this way. Are there any signs that we're going to get that kind of regional coordination or provincial oversight that would make our plans more meaningful and perhaps mitigate our costs?
I can answer that one. I think there's indication the province did recently support the Lower Mainland flood management strategy with some funding, and there's a lot of participation by the province. I think it's got a long way to go, the regional flood management strategy, but it's certainly moving in the right direction.
And just my last one, because I have one.
I'd like to add to that briefly.
Okay.
Tamsin and the
Take it
team, we've
away.
been working with many municipalities in the Lower Mainland for a coordinated approach. So while we may not be in the driver's seat, we are really working hard to make sure that that coordination is occurring.
So what I'm going to suggest, because Councillor Meggs, you're over time, and some of these questions are quite complex on a very large piece of work, is that we have a second round of questions so that we can pursue the issues that I'm going to have to cut you off on further. Okay. Councillor Stevenson.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the report. None of the areas you brought up dealt specifically with the West End, and I'm wondering, yeah, they're all rushing to their place to secure it.
We, sorry, for those that are trying to follow this along at home, the folks who were here on the Bring Your Kid to Work Day are all leaving, so we might just take a minute to let them go.
Yep.
Have a good time at City Hall today. Okay, Councillor Stevenson.
I'm wondering about that. I mean, to me, the West End is completely surrounded by water. Now I realize that you have the kind of harbor on both sides, English Bay, but Falls Creek is one that you zeroed in on. So why is that?
Okay, yeah, that's my mistake. We did look at the West End. That's in one of the 11 zones. It was West End and Stanley Park. So given the topography of the West End, limited flood risk right now, of course over time some flood risk to the beach and park areas. So looking at what we can do on the seawall or raising areas of the parks to provide some protection.
So that's kind of good news for the West End. Well, I knew I lived in the right place. On the area of education, would you say that the populace is basically pretty ignorant to the dangers and what's in the future, or do you think that there's some level of understanding or a greater level of understanding? Where do you think, what's the educational piece going to be to?
I can take a guess at where I think it lies. I think there's an understanding that sea level rise is an impact or consequence of climate change. I'm not confident.
You have to believe in climate change, of course. Too.
Yes, true. I'm not sure that there's an understanding that what the impacts might be to the city of Vancouver or to the lower mainland, just given topography and being a coastal city. So I think that there's an education opportunity there.
And do you see people making any decisions based on this concern about, I mean, people not buying close to the ocean, or is there any kind of sense of that it affects prices?
No, I don't think so. We haven't seen anything like that or had any indications of that. Certainly, I've had a very small number of phone calls and conversations about areas of the city that could be flood prone to the end of the century. I think it's good to remember that we have a fair bit of time here, which is great, so we can be proactive.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Stevenson. Councillor Carr.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you for all the work to you and the whole team. To me, it's very critical. Our city's future is really at risk here. My first question has to do with really, it's a follow-up on Councillor Stevenson, a connection to the source of the problem. And I'm wondering why we haven't in this report, and could we in future reports always include a section which explains for people why we've got sea level rise. Because it is, you talked about the data and threshold data, et cetera, but it's clear, I mean, I've read the IPCC reports, I've read James Hansen, I read the science. daily. And it's clear, I mean, maybe people don't know, but if we lose Antarctica, we're talking a 15-meter rise just from the loss of Antarctic ice. And Antarctica is the loss of Antarctic ice, especially from undersea currents, is one of the reasons why we've got new predictions that double from what BC is using. So is it possible to include some explanatory section? Because I think that the public needs to hear that in terms of getting behind measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Carr. That's a good reminder to tie this message back to what can be done on the mitigation side, the actions that everyone can take. It's difficult to suggest actions that people can take for sea level rise, but certainly there's lots that individuals and residents can do on the mitigation side. And I just watched the Leonardo Before the Flood National Geographic movie, and that was a good reminder. You know, it focused a lot on the impacts, but then went straight to what we can do at home today.
Right. I'm disappointed that the province has kept sticking with low levels of predictions in terms of sea level rise, 90 centimeters by 2100. So are we as a city doing our own research, incorporating other science? Are we taking the lead, not from the province, but from IPCC, for example?
Certainly, we looked at a range of scenarios in our planning to be able to incorporate that range envelope of projections. Of course, the science continues to change and has even changed since we started the study in 2012. So I think that's why it's important to have this adaptive management piece to monitor and to always incorporate the best science. I know the province was planning on reviewing theirs every 5 years, which would be a review this year, I believe.
That's good. I think the science is changing faster. In fact, I think the temperature is changing faster, and so are emissions. Emissions are still going up, as you know, I'm sure. In terms of one thing that we know in all the scenarios you described, adaptive measures, adaptive building measures, for example, are something that you need to couple with any other measure. So can you just speak to how we plan to move forward? I was very intrigued by a number of shots of no residential on floor one, the barriers that can come out for flood protection in the doorways. And I'm aware of the public reaction to the increased cost of building when we change our flood levels. And so how are we expecting to handle the need versus the public concern?
So in terms of next steps on resilient buildings, we did have a primer done a few years ago, sort of looking preliminarily at what sorts of measures can be taken to make homes more flood resilient. And now we're collaborating with BC Housing in the province to look at resilient building measures. So what can be done, hopefully low cost measures all the way to how to retrofit existing buildings for flood proofing. And I don't have a good answer to the cost versus benefit.
Right. It appears like the cost is a shared cost, isn't it? In this case, the financial strategy is that private landowners will incur costs as a measure. It's not all about dikes and protective measures that we as public agencies put into it, but it's each person who owns land realizing that they need to build to a different level to protect their buildings and property.
Yeah, that's correct. And to date, we did not have flood insurance in Canada, not for river or coastal flooding, but certainly that's been introduced just in the last few months, flood insurance. So of course, if property owners take measures to make their properties more flood resilient, that may affect their insurance costs.
Right. I know I'm out of time, Madam Chair, but I will go back on this. Thank you.
Okay, that would be great. I have some questions, but what I'm going to suggest is we just do the procedural thing we need to do here. I need a motion under 6.8 of the procedure bylaw to suspend the rules of order to allow for another round of questioning. It is a non-debatable motion. Thank you. I now will ask those in favor. Any opposed? Okay, that passes. So I will ask some questions, and then we'll go back to the list. Ms. Mills, I will start I forgot to get myself on the list, so I will start a timer. First question was around that issue that Councillor Meggs was raising about if you had any opinions on what the best agency to coordinate at a regional level was. I know Fraser Basin Council is doing work, Metro through the Climate Action Committee has been doing a fair amount of technical review. You've got FRAMP doing, anyway, you've got a lot of different agencies. So did you have some opinions on who might be best to coordinate that?
I certainly think that more involvement from the province and the flood hazard group at the province and public safety and emergency management BC. So those groups at the provincial level that deal with flooding right now could work together better and support the region and advocate to the federal government as well.
Right. And Fraser Basin Council, who's sort of been asserting themselves into this territory, they don't have any statutory or regulatory or taxation or other authority that I can think of?
No, that's correct. They're just coordinating the members of this group. One of the steps in this second phase of work is to put together a governance structure, looking at different models. So they'll be doing that study now.
Okay. Okay. Second question was on vulnerable populations. I know on the flooding side, it's sort of more the extreme rain. I mean, the weather we've had the last month has had a definite impact, especially on people living outside. But even those inside are dealing with much worse internal living environments because they already have a lot of mold and not the greatest moisture barrier buildings, let's say. How have we looked at that in terms of sea level rise? I appreciate a lot of these areas are not the ones that vulnerable populations tend to live in, Jericho or other Southlands, those sorts, but certainly downtown East Side has a good chunk of vulnerable areas. So what's our work on that look like?
Yes, certainly the vulnerability assessment done in phase one did look at vulnerable populations at risk. And as you pointed out, False Creek Flats, portions of the downtown East Side. And one of the considerations in comparing approaches was populations at risk that would be affected by either implementation of the flood management option or by a flood. But certainly we have a lot of work to do in that realm with adaptation generally, sea level rise, but also heat and rainfall, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd be interested in more information on that, not necessarily at council, but a memo or something in that regard would, I think, be helpful. Last question probably doesn't have a clear answer, but it goes to the social behavior side of things. So Jericho, you were showing the raised bike path. I was thinking about how difficult it's been to have a discussion in some communities about mitigation measures. How much do you look at the social science of education, getting people to understand the impacts that are coming?
Yeah, we looked at that a fair bit, looking at engaging on sea level rise and climate change generally. I think there's a lot of tricky bits in terms of fear and action and what can be done at the individual levels. So there's a lot being done in that realm internationally, a lot of good projects. We're looking at public art and engagement through that realm and a variety of different ways of engaging.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Mayor Robertson.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
I just have to reset the timers because everybody's a little off their 5. Okay, there you go.
Thanks for the opportunity to do another round. So I had questions, kind of the next steps around covering the costs of this. And I'm curious if the team working on this has done any work looking at covering the costs through various means and whether you've done any investigation of the legal actions that are starting to emerge around corporate accountability and in particular fossil fuel companies, oil and gas industry, ending up in legal cases now around causation of these impacts. They're direct costs to our taxpayers, but this is not an act of God. This is tied directly to human activity. And I know there's now a growing body of legal evidence and investigation on this. I'm curious if the team looked at that at all or if that's a next step that we should be pursuing.
Thanks. Yes, so we did look preliminary ideas with the finance department on different mechanisms for covering costs moving forward. There's a study by SFU on the cost of adaptation and different mechanisms. Certainly, there's a lot of need for support from other levels of government to make this happen. In terms of the legal issues, we haven't looked at that. It's a good next step. I was approached by West Coast Environmental Law, and they are doing a study currently on adaptation costs linked back to fossil fuels. So we'll be involved in that study.
Okay, at this point, I guess the challenge is we have enough difficulty getting funding from provincial and federal governments just to keep the lights on here in Vancouver. Whether we look at our transit or housing or infrastructure needs, this is a whole additional piece that was never anticipated, and there's growing evidence that it is connected to business activity and carbon emissions. So I think it's obviously a piece that we need to flag in terms of the financing strategy that you outline as being a key piece, a next step, an immediate next step for us. I think we're going to need to understand what work is taking place there and how we connect the dots between the costs that we are going to have to absorb and that the taxpayers are expected to cover right now, billions of dollars of impacts when there is a cause. And I know that the analogy I've heard out there is the tobacco companies and lung cancer and the legal actions that ensued from that. But obviously the causation isn't as direct, and there's a body of work taking place there. But I appreciate the response on that, and I think that's something we'll have to consider as council in terms of next steps. It's probably beyond the scope of this direct look, but maybe in that financing strategy, there's something flagged there about where we can go next in terms of the legal steps to protect our taxpayers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Robertson. Councillor Meigs.
Well, you may have answered it, Ms. Mills, but it might be for you or for Mr. Johnson, but have staff say it in real estate or finance, but I guess finance started to consider what strategies we might have to apply for a reasonable estimation of the city's share of these costs, so the taxpayers can begin to absorb those realities and begin to think through the impacts. Because I think that if the reason being, if council is going to raise its share, a responsible share to contribute and leverage other funds, it's a big number, and outside our current ask. So I wonder if real estate or anyone else has been working with your group to try to figure some of those things out, and in some ways we might raise that money if council decided to do so.
Yeah, thank you. We have had preliminary conversations with the finance group at the city, but certainly we have a lot more conversation in that realm.
Yeah, I think it's, given the election coming in 2 years, it's not a bad time to begin to daylight that so that people don't get surprised.
Thanks. In addition to what's been outlined, we are looking at how other places have done it, because there are cities that are a few steps ahead of us, including San Francisco, where they actually put a particular charge on properties that were in the floodplain that would be protected by those measures, so that over a 50-year period that gets accrued before you make the actual investment. So there are different approaches that could be more geographically specific. And then also, obviously, working with the federal government, I think they've recognized that there are expenses here and have included some frameworks around adaptation costs and how that might be included in the infrastructure costs. So as we see additional studies, and even in Jericho, some of the places where we might need to make more immediate investments, we'd be going for that funding as well.
Thanks. That's all my questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Councillor Meigs. Councillor Carr.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. So just to follow up on what the city can do, and I was talking about building codes is one, and how fast we could move on changing or updating building codes to be as proactive as possible. So again, if you could just explain that the process or what your thinking is around how much we can move, how deeply we can move on building codes.
So I'm Pat Ryan, the Chief Building Official. We actually moved immediately. We became aware of the issue when the province announced their report 5 years ago about sea level rise, and we had informal changes to building height done immediately.
Yes.
And then we enacted into the recent bylaw in 2014.
That's the flood construction level.
Yeah, so we are well ahead of the curve,
Yes.
and we're future-proof for many years now because of that, and we're continually updating and changing. So if any more reasonable changes become apparent, we will do them immediately.
Thank you.
And typically,
Appreciate
these
that.
costs are fairly minor for new construction. It's not such a big deal, and it's way cheaper than dealing with the aftermath of a flood.
I think that's a good piece of information to include in our reports as well, that the cost, if you meet building code standards with new construction, really mitigates longer term higher costs.
Well, and Tamsin did some amazing research, particularly from the Calgary flood, and we adopted a lot of those measures into the bylaw. So even if your building does flood, the damage is fairly easily repaired. And one thing we did not move on was collapse of the building.
Yeah.
Like we were adamant that a building will structurally withstand a load of a flood or any logs or debris in the path, regardless of what the heights were. We required that almost immediately in any new designs coming in.
Fantastic. It's a good corollary, too, to the fact that there's a myth out there that building to zero emissions is going to cost an arm and a leg, when evidence is showing that it's not. And if you include the operational costs, it really doesn't cost more. It saves money. So those, one of which is a preventative, the other is an adaptive. But getting those pieces of information out, I think, would be very important.
Well, and that's actually a good point you make, is the green building model generally has payback 5-7 years maximum.
Yeah.
So we're doing very well on that model too. We're not enacting things that don't really have any paybacks.
Yeah.
So we're doing very well in that respect.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another area in which the city does have authority and can make decisions is around location of development. So, you talked about retreat as a possible mitigation measure. Of course, I come from a geography background where Ian McCargan Design with Nature says don't build, in your floodplain areas. Yet we as a city are looking at increasing density, residential density around Falls Creek, which is a very vulnerable area. So I'm just wondering, at what risk does that put the city? At what risk in the future, maybe legal even, if we know that that's an area that's vulnerable, and yet make decisions in our plans to increase residential density, do we face the possibility of risk in the future? Are we assessing that?
Yes, we are assessing risk, and of course we assessed it at today's development, but we need to look forward as well and think about the risk as you add people and things and assets to a location, you increase the risk being based on consequences and the likelihood. So certainly that's a consideration. There are a lot of existing assets in some of these areas. So certainly I think the approach would be to protect those existing assets in some way over time, but certainly to look at where added density happens and specifically where critical infrastructure goes.
Yeah, I am curious about that because, for example, with the relocation plans of St. Paul's Hospital to move in Falls Creek, I'm aware in other jurisdictions there are restrictions done at the civic level or at the state level in the United States where they say, no, you can't put hospitals, schools, first responders, facilities, fire halls, police stations in high-risk areas I was thinking specifically of the tsunami zone that they have outlined in Oregon, but there are certain restrictions. Have we contemplated that?
That's certainly a recommendation in the report to look at where we put critical infrastructure. Again, there's existing critical infrastructure. I know with the St. Paul's Hospital, the planning team's working hard to make it as resilient as possible, a leader in resilience, and they're going over and above the flood construction level. But I think moving forward, that's an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I really appreciate your answers and all the work, as I say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm realizing I had a question I didn't ask, although this whole line of questioning about liability has added another question, which is I'm not sure there's a legal answer for it, but if we're investigating the liability of third parties for creating these costs, I'd be interested to know if it's possible to determine the threshold at which we are liable for not acting. Does that make sense? Like, we've known about sea level rise as a possibility since the 1970s. So at what point, sorry, not at this level of granular detail, but the possibility has existed for a long time. So at what point do we become liable for not taking reasonable actions? I don't mean we as a group of people, but we as an institution. I would be very surprised if you had an answer today, but I'd be interested to know.
I think that
A little bit.
I would.
May I jump in?
Sure.
We have done extensive work on this, and we'd be happy to do a briefing in camera. I'd prefer to talk about liability issues outside of this format, just given kind of as a regulator of land use, we take many factors into account when approving projects, and so maybe we could come back to you on that.
I was more interested in the structural question of when one can determine the threshold, but I appreciate that there's been extensive work done on that question. So the second question was a process question as well, although not related to legal issues. The adaptable planning framework that you've used to inform this work, I personally believe has a lot of promise on many policy areas. So I'm curious to know if we have, I know you have been very busy on the issues around adaptation, but maybe Mr. Kelly or Mr. Smith or somebody has an idea of whether we might start moving that kind of planning framework into other policy areas.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it is something we should look at pretty carefully. I can't say that we have done that yet, but it's certainly worth investigating, because this philosophy of planning for relative unknowns is really important to do across a broad suite of areas, I would suggest. And I'd take the question under consideration as we move forward with other planning efforts.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you very much for all your work on this. It is, I think Councillor Carr alluded to it, and Mayor Robertson, it is very much globally significant, groundbreaking work. I was on a panel some years ago, moderating a panel, and realizing we were the only city on the panel that hadn't, every other city had had a massive disaster and then written an adaptation strategy as a result of it. And this really is not only at the leading edge, but proactively at the leading edge, which speaks volumes to all of your work. Thank you. Okay, we are on to a more immediate question around public toilets, increased accessibility to public toilets. Councillor Ball, I have to admit I cannot remember whether or not you introduced this yesterday, so perhaps I will invite you to do that right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I will just briefly introduce this. This is actually about accessible public toilets. And just to be really clear, our wonderful Seniors Committee...
Councillor Ball, you don't have to get up. I'm sorry, we're in committee.
Thank you for reminding me.
Okay.
Our wonderful Seniors Committee has been listening, as usual, to the wider community. And as is well known, anything that's good for seniors is usually good for the rest of our population. We do have public toilets available in Vancouver. However, given our population and the size of our population, we certainly don't have enough accessible toilets. That means toilets that are available for the disabled and indeed for anyone, that are easily accessible and that can be used within a community. Anyone who's traveled to Europe knows that most of the time you're able to, without any problem, find a toilet very, very close. And mothers with children, anyone with a disability is able to access those toilets, which are self-cleaning. Not all countries have them, but many, many cities and countries do. I believe that Vancouver is on the cusp of realizing what it is to be disabled and to not be able to really fulfill the greatest need that most people have at any time in their lives. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the motion, which is a result of all the work that is being done by our Seniors Committee, and be able to move to our speakers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Ball. Did councillors have questions of staff? Councillor DeGenova? Okay, then I'm just going to advance you all off the queue and invite our first speaker up, which is Colleen McGuinness. Ms. McGuinness, I know you know, but I will, for the benefit of everyone, state the rules for speakers, which are much, much shorter than those for councillors, which involve sticking to a 5-minute time limit. There might be questions from council afterwards, so if you could just stay at the podium till we've determined whether that's the case, that would be great. Welcome.
I can do this in less than 5 minutes.
Can I just, the red, yeah, there you go. It's more for the benefit of people not here to be able to hear you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of council. I'm here today on behalf of the Seniors Committee. And I promise I'll try and keep away from any of the puns that seem appropriate for this particular subject. First of all, I want to thank Councillor Ball because this motion was presented to us some months ago, and it got lost in the shuffle of the activities and was revitalized and put forward at our September meeting. Seniors Advisory Committee in the last while has been focused on isolation and loneliness. And because of that, for some people, the uncertainty of access to washrooms limits where they go and whether or not they actually leave home. It's not only age that changes your focus on the proximity of bathrooms, but it sure helps. We have found that accessibility for seniors is a benefit for everyone. But in the case of bathrooms, there is a loss of dignity if a person cannot get where they need to go quickly. And we want to take the pressure off in some particular situations where there isn't available retail space, so that you're not providing saying that the bathroom is provided because there's a Starbucks nearby or whatever, or there's an obligation to buy something in order to have access to a washroom. And then just to conclude, the washroom that was installed at the new Jim Diva Plaza was originally not accessible. And so we know that a replacement is on order, but it was that kind of thing where we felt that it was critical that this be something that staff were particularly aware of. We sent people down to check out the washroom and it failed. So we want staff to think that accessibility is a first priority, not an afterthought or a fix. And the new Arbutus Greenway is another development where accessible washrooms incorporated in the planning will make it a very, very useful and comfortable place for people, and would, perhaps in some cases, get them out of their home or apartment. Enough said. I think you understand our concern, and I hope that you'll support our recommendation.
Thank you, Ms. McGinnis. You do have some questions, so I will move us to Councillor Ball.
Thank you very much. In terms of the social isolation and loneliness, one of the things I remember being mentioned in the project that you're going forward is events and people stopping being able to come to events because they are afraid something will happen, and some of those events are very important to them. So do you mind sort of giving your impression as to what happens there and what kind of events people aren't able to get to any longer?
Well, I guess with my own experience working at City Hall over the years, one of my claims to fame, if you will, when I was assisting with the Remembrance Day program, I discovered that never had anybody made provision for washrooms. So veterans were coming from Langley and Abbotsford and Chilliwack and wherever in order to be at Victory Square for 11 o'clock. And then if their age and prostate, etc., required, they were forced to go into the back lanes. And that seemed to be a very inappropriate thing to do for people who deserved much better. So the city provided a budget for porta potties. I think that when we move forward with our activities with the isolation and loneliness workshops, accessibility will have to be a key consideration to the location. Does it have wheelchair access? Does it have accessible washrooms? Does it have fresh air? There are people who are sensitive to chemicals and all the rest of it. So the location can't just be anywhere that offers, but rather it has to meet a certain set of criteria.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And let's hope that Remembrance Day is truly accessible this year. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
You do have a couple other counselors with questions, starting with Counselor DeGenova.
Thank you, Ms. McGinnis. I have to say, sitting as one of the liaisons to the Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee, I know that this is also an issue that they are very passionate about, and I believe that your committee has done work with their committee before in the past to address issues regarding mobility and accessibility in the city. Would you be able to comment on that a little bit?
I'm delighted to say that we have, at most of our meetings, at least 2 people from the Persons with Disability Committee. We work very closely because what happens to one group is very similar in its impact to the other. And so we agree to disagree from time to time, but in most issues we are on the same track.
Very good, thank you. I also had a question regarding areas in the city. Was there a number of accessible washrooms, a goal that the committee would have? As you said, Jim Diva Plaza for public washrooms. As you mentioned, I mean, and especially understanding, as I used to be a liaison to the Seniors Advisory Committee, that it can be cost prohibitive for someone to go into a Starbucks and purchase a coffee or a piece of food so that they can use the washroom. Is there any goal or idea from the committee on how many washrooms there should be a benchmark for? Or how many should we have throughout our neighborhoods? Should they all be accessible?
Our point was whatever the city does going forward should be accessible. Beyond that, we weren't making any statistical analysis that it should be within, 200 feet or whatever. It's just that going forward, and I guess the Jim Diva Plaza situation was the trigger, in that here is a whole infrastructure that was to make the community, bring the community together, and then we don't have an accessible washroom.
And then an idea behind that is, I suppose someone who didn't have mobility issues or a disability could also use it. But then so could someone who did have those issues.
Exactly. Anything that works for a person with a disability will always work for everyone else.
I understand that, but it's good to hear that that's something that the committee endorses and certainly is moving forward with. Thank you very much for making the time to come this morning.
Thanks, Councillor DeGenova. Councillor Jang had some questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And just understanding the Seniors Committee a little bit and sort of the thoughts that went into it. I know public washrooms have been debated many times in the city of Vancouver, and I know we've had some pretty awful experiences with public washrooms, whether they're on Main Street, right by the Carnegie, or virtually anywhere, where they become shooting galleries, places where people are turning tricks, people are doing drugs. We've seen deals go down in them, and that's why, for example, the ones on Main Street were closed for a while, is because despite people really needing and have to go somewhere, the amount of illegal activity in those places was huge. Similarly, in other cities around the world, I've been to the public washrooms and I've essentially walked out, right, for either they were unkept or there was other activities going on there. And so I'm asking whether or not the committee looked at those types of issues besides accessibility, taking the context that this has been a long discussion about public washrooms in Vancouver for a long time. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not a perfect world. And so whatever we do can be a misadventure if that's what somebody is intent on. I think our concern is that, and we're talking a single unit, so that, it's not like some of the larger multi-purpose, multi-person units. I honestly don't know how you prevent some of that. I know places where the washroom is accessible. They've taken out the mirror so that people can't use the mirror when they're using drugs and want to inject. You you can simplify, but you still, the greater part of the population needs a place.
Okay.
And that's, we're looking at the total community. And,
Right.
and what you've identified is a piece of that is definitely going to use it for other purposes possibly.
Okay. Well, that's what I was sort of thinking about was whenever there's a private space, as we know that there's a fentanyl crisis that's throughout the city, right? Drug use, mental health issues, everything is throughout the city. It's not just the downtown east side anymore. It's everywhere. And one of the issues I know that even we did water carts for folks who were homeless throughout the city in the hot. They were abused and used for all sorts of things. So I suppose one thing I would like the seniors committee to think about is sort of the other half of the equation. As staff start working on this or what have you, to start thinking about how we can mitigate those issues, because I think certainly over the many years I've been here, every time we've had a discussion about public amenities like this, it's always abused, and then we land up closing it, and then there's always a big fight later: who's going to clean it up, who's going to actually manage it. And I would love some of your insight and wisdoms on those types of issues, which really turn a good thing into something that becomes a liability.
But, if you look at BC Transit and the fact that the SkyTrain stations do not have a washroom, and they do, but you have to ask, and nobody knows to ask, and they count on the Starbucks and the adjacent businesses to provide that service, and then provide the cleanup and the supplies and all the rest of it. There is no easy answer, but I have been in the downtown east side, and I have seen people using the back lane, and that is an indignity that they have to go through because there isn't any alternative. And so we're just saying that as a city, as washrooms are made available, they should be accessible.
Okay.
And the larger issues of misuse and misadventure, that's kind of out of our realm.
Well, I don't know if it is. I mean, that's part of the question.
Councillor Jang, you are into debate with the speaker, so
I had another question.
Well, let's hear it.
Gosh. So, would you, as part of your deliberations as a seniors committee, actually look at these larger issues? It's because I think, there is much to be gained from wisdom over time, as opposed to simply saying, let's just open up washrooms because people need them. But then we got the other issues, like, for example, probably one of the reasons why they're not at SkyTrain stations, I know for a fact, is because of the issues that I've identified. So would you be able to put your minds to this in order to try to help us come up with a solution?
Okay. I'm just
That was
going
a
to,
question.
in that regard, yes, Ms. McGuinness.
Our committee is made up of people who come from all parts of the community. And so when we have a discussion, all of those elements are taken into consideration. But at the end of the day, we concluded that accessible washrooms were still an urgent need, if you would.
Okay. Councillor Carr, I'm sorry, I've put myself on to try and time myself, but I will bump you up and I'll put myself on afterwards. Councillor Carr, questions?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, Ms. McGuinness, for coming here and the work on the committee and your committee members. Some of the line of questioning prompted me to ask you a specific question around whether or not the committee actually had in discussion of this, a discussion around sort of cities that any of your members may have visited that have best practices. In other words, examples somewhere else that, or even in the history of Vancouver, that exemplify the kind of either location, design style, safety features that you would want to see in Vancouver?
I have to confess, this motion came forward from our Transportation and Mobility Subcommittee, and they examined this at length. And the leader for that was Gudrun Langoff, and she's not available today. So I can't honestly answer that.
Perhaps, would it be possible for you to take back this question to your committee and provide a response that can be shared with staff?
Yes.
Great, I'd appreciate that. And I just have to say, I have to also remark if there, or ask if there's any solutions that you find or that you can provide in terms of almost instruction to the public. I was very profoundly affected when I was younger and was downtown, and an elderly woman soiled herself as she was crossing the street at Georgia and Granville, and I still remember this so vividly, and she was so horrified. And I helped her, and then I didn't know where to go. Like, I didn't have a clue about which, you know, there was no, I mean, the bay was right there, but that's many stories up to get to a washroom, and anyway, we did go into the bay. But, you know, if there's any kind of almost advice coming forward, you know, generally, what would you want to see in terms of public response to an unfortunate kind of incident like that? How can people help, you know, in being this a city that's friendly to seniors and people with disabilities?
Well, one of the things would be to have sufficient that you know where to direct people.
Right, right.
You know, you asked about examples, and one that I do know of a city that has taken a slightly different approach. There is a German city, it might be Munich or Frankfurt, which pays the local businesses to make their washrooms available. And so they've taken a different approach, and they've said to all of the places that have washrooms, we will pay you a small, I guess it has to do with maybe a percentage of the square footage of the business or whatever, but they pay the businesses to take that responsibility on behalf of the city.
That's great kind of information. I think if you could forward it to us as council, and we can make sure it gets to, or staff specifically, if you wish. Thank you.
We didn't want to offer that one because that didn't seem, it's a fix, it's not a solution.
Mm-hmm. It's good to always weigh the various approaches that have been taken elsewhere.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. I had one question that would help me out here. So hearing the intro and hearing your comments, it sounds like the sort of nub of this is the accessibility of the washrooms.
Yes.
So the motion itself says to establish appropriate design specification and placements for public toilets. I feel like if the word accessible public toilets were in there, it might provide more guidance to staff.
I think that is absolutely correct.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much for that clarification.
We are amateurs at writing motions.
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm mindful of the fact that we do have design specification and placement, so this helps me understand more about what this motion was intending to do.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I do not see either Jill Weiss or Eva Valdona. Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Stevenson. There's one more question, Ms. McGuinness. Sorry about that.
This is just as a result of what you're already saying and talking about availability or accessibility to stores throughout the city that that might be paid by the city to open up washrooms. I have found that to be really helpful in places in Europe where you know
and that's the example was from Germany.
Yeah.
And, that information came after our motion was
Drafted
and into circulation to you. It's a possibility. I'm not sure, and staff would have to tell you whether the cost of installing an accessible washroom over time was more or less than the cost of paying a lot of businesses in the community.
Yeah.
But I think also too, in some cases, if you pay a business to do it, you're confined to business hours. And so if a business closes at 6 and people are using a public space into the evening,
That's
And
true,
you-
but it can be both and. I mean, it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I know that when I opened up an office a number of years ago when I was the MLA, and I opened up a street front office, we hadn't even thought of this, but we were required to have an accessible washroom.
but
Now,
was that for your staff or was that for the larger?
well, it was for the staff, but obviously anybody could use it if we gave permission. So if you and that was a huge expense to add a washroom just to a small office, and it seemed, when you think about it, kind of a waste for 4 staff people altogether. So if there were a number of places like that, in addition to what you're talking about in the motion, I think it might really be worthwhile, because you can't always find where that accessible washroom is, and being a senior myself now, I know how important it is to.
And the loss of dignity if
Yes, absolutely.
or the concern if the medical situation is critical, that you just don't leave home. And that's part of the loneliness and isolation that we're looking at.
I'm getting a tough time from my colleague here who's saying you're a senior now. I have been a senior for a while, yes.
And there'll be a lot more of us.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for something that sounded not like a question. So I'm going to move to the next speaker on the list. Jill Weiss, not here. No. Ava Waldona, not here. No. So that brings us to Deli Lydyard. The matter of whether or not you're a senior is not a question, Councillor Stevenson.
Good morning.
Ms. Lydyard, if you wanted to lower the podium, you're welcome to, although you're welcome to have it wherever you like. It's just on the right side there. Anyway, whatever works for you. Thank you, Councillor Carr.
I don't know how to do this. Oh, wow.
It's our
this is
accessible
like
podium.
Anyway, good morning, Madam Chair and council members. Colleen has already mentioned most of the things that I was going to mention before, but I want to flag certain things in light of what was discussed. One is there is a need for public washrooms. It doesn't matter whether it's provided by whoever, but there is a need. And people become isolated sometimes because they are worried that they have no places to go, when they're out there participating in public celebrations or, any kind of activities out there. So that really does not matter, what form it takes, but we need accessible bathrooms. And you've asked about designs and things like that. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that the Seniors Advisory Committee, who are volunteers and who may not have experience in that respect, are capable of providing. But, all we're trying to do here is identify a need that exists and a need that has been brought to our attention by our constituency. And I think we have a responsibility to do that. Thank you.
Thank you for those succinct comments. You have some questions from council.
Okay.
Starting with Councillor DeGenova.
Thank you very much for coming. I was hoping you could answer a question that came from some of the other questions that I'd heard from other councillors that Ms. McGuinness answered. Of course, you don't have to answer them. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just wondering, because you have so much knowledge and you have sat on the Seniors Advisory Committee for certainly more than one term, I'm just wondering if you might be able to comment on what you've heard or your experience with other seniors who may feel, I mean, we had heard another councillor ask questions about a trade-off. Is it better to have a washroom that may be a little unkempt, or than to, as we had heard from other people, to have to resort to using a lane or a public place. I mean, would you feel that a private washroom provided by the city would be seen as somewhere that seniors wouldn't see as safe?
Well, I think a washroom is the desired, goal, right? To have available washrooms for seniors, right? I think a lane is not acceptable under any circumstance, right? So you're saying, would it be acceptable if it's slightly unkempt? I mean, well, if you have to go, then whatever is available is acceptable, I mean, some people need to go because they have health issues, it's not just because of age, but because they have medical conditions that need to, that require that kind of thing. So, I'd say, having it there is better than having nothing.
I agree with you, but thank you for answering my question. Also, in the motion that Councillor Ball put forward that I was more than happy to second, it talks about consulting with the Seniors Advisory Committee, but the council establish appropriate design specifications. So really, this will be a consultation process where the Seniors Advisory Committee would be consulted on maybe making sure it's in well-lit areas or areas where perhaps people might feel more safe in using those washrooms. Do you feel that that consultation is important?
Well, I think those are things that are, normally required, under any circumstance. When you provide a venue for certain activities, you want it well lit. When you provide a place that people will use, you make sure it's well lit. It's safety, right? So, I think it goes without saying. In terms of design, I think our biggest and only concern is that it be accessible to everybody, because some seniors use mobility devices, scooters, and wheelchairs, right? It's not just the persons with disabilities have those problems. And as you age, there's more and more of the same thing. So I think our main concern about the design is that it be accessible, at least in my view.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor DeGenova. We have questions from Councillor Ball.
And thank you for coming in spite of the rain today and waiting. So thank you. I do know that the committee has been aware of the map, the van map, where all the washrooms are in the city, and is aware of the number that exist at the moment. But the issue is simply that there are not accessible washrooms in terms of the number of people that need to access them. And I'm just wondering if your committee has discussed it all, because I haven't been at every committee discussion or subcommittee discussion, just whether you want them all over the city or in certain places. Do you think they'd be more advantageous, or have you had any chance to discuss that at all?
Well, I think in my committee we've discussed the fact that if you're going to have a washroom anywhere, if you're going to put them anywhere, they all have to be accessible, because you never know who's going to be using it, right? Mm-hmm. And by making it not accessible, it excludes certain people, mm-hmm. which is a discriminatory practice as far as I'm concerned.
So you're looking at all over the city, and that's what you're thinking?
All over the city where you are placing them, right?
Yes.
Because some of them are already there, and some of them are not accessible. And I question the fact, why aren't they accessible?
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming in.
That's it for questions. Thank you very much, Ms. Bridgard. Next up, we have Lynn Shepard from the Westside Seniors Hub. Nope. Okay, then that is it for registered speakers. So we are on to the point in the agenda where if councillors had questions for staff, this would be the point to get on the speakers list. Okay, questions from Councillor Ball for Mr. Kovich or Mr. Johnson? We'll see who wants to field them. Okay, Councillor Ball.
Yes, thank you very much. I am aware that we do have a map which people can look at to see where public washrooms are in the city. But for many seniors and for many who are disabled, of course, the map doesn't work because they can't go there. So I'm wondering if there's a way to mark on our maps what washrooms are accessible to date, and if we have any plans at the moment in the works for accessible washrooms, what are they?
Okay, I'll maybe start with your last question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Danica Đurković, Director of Facilities Planning and Development. Just to provide a little bit more clarity how we implement washrooms in the city, there are basically three groups that touch on public washrooms. One is building folk, facilities folk, which is under my preview, and that includes all city-owned buildings, city-owned and operated buildings, so many public buildings like community centers, libraries, and similar. Second group is engineering. They started doing public washrooms on sidewalks. Probably most people have seen automatic public washrooms we have around the city. And third group is, as well as some plazas that they own, like Jim Diva Plaza is under engineering preview. And third group is park board. So park development folk deal with washrooms in parks. I might also add that reference to Remembrance Day event is dealt through special events. So those are also looked at on case-by-case basis, and event organizers are responsible to look for additional washrooms based on event occupancy and so on. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more clarity as to how we touch on these. When it comes to buildings, so a city owns 217 public washrooms, including all of the groups above I mentioned, not included special events. Those are typically additional porta potties that are brought for events specifically. And those include everything from the street, parks, plazas, and buildings. When it comes to buildings world, that one is most regulated one. So we are required to build accessible washrooms either when we do renovation or new buildings. So you'll see all our new buildings would have accessible washrooms, and we have made efforts to actually go over and above the code and worked with Persons with Disability Committee in particular, as well as Seniors Committee on Killarney, recent Senior Center, and LGBTQ. Those accessibility issues overlap quite a bit. They don't exclude each other, they just kind of enhance. But we've done models in seniors for Killarney, for example, where we chose not to go with male-female group washrooms and universal on the side. All of the washrooms provided there will be universal single-use occupancy. So some projects will allow us to actually push much further based on space, functionality, and so on, but others are quite regulated and they do require accessible washroom. I would say when it comes to plazas, sidewalks, and parks, unless we are talking buildings in parks, those are less regulated. So it's great to bring this attention to an issue, and you know, I completely agree with the mention of if we are to provide washroom and it's only one, it should be accessible. It's a kind of no-brainer. So when it comes to communication, I think there's opportunity to do more work there and to be to have, that's what we've heard from advisory committees as well. It's really important for people with either disabilities or health issues or whatever to plan their trips and know where they're heading, what's available and on what's not. So I think we can certainly enhance that information on our webpage and or through pamphlets. We've been working with civic theaters and that has been done for civic theaters already to date, but we can do more on other public washrooms as well.
That's wonderful to hear. So we could have it on Van Maps or a specific map saying, here's where you can go if, you know, you're planning your trip, just so you're safe.
If I could jump in, Councillor, we have over the last few years taken considerable efforts to map out publicly available restrooms in the downtown east side for many of the folks there that may not have access to washrooms, particularly given the conditions in the SROs. we could take that approach and do a citywide map. As Danica has indicated, there's 217 restrooms that the city operates in libraries and other places. We could put them all on a map, and then we could indicate which ones are actually accessible. That would be a one step forward. We've just done, as Danica indicated, we've done some assessments of city facilities to map out which ones have accessible restrooms as a part of a broader building assessment process. So that would be one first step that we could do almost immediately. We could print that out and share it with the committee. We could make it available at senior centers and places like that for folks that are planning trips while we do the rest of the things that are outlined. So we'd be happy to undertake that as a part of this process if it's approved.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.
Ball, you are at time. That's okay.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor Deal, questions for staff?
Yes, thanks very much, and you've answered some of my questions already. Thank you. The current design that we have for the public washrooms that are on the streets, they have the wheelchair symbol on them for accessibility. Are they considered accessible under today's standards?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so those are accessible washrooms. And are those standards changing over time of what's considered accessible?
Not as much. I would say as far as physical space, they're about the same. It's more, we are currently looking and doing some work on LGBTQ transgender signage appropriateness, as well as some security issues that Councillor Yang mentioned earlier. Those will always be an issue. But I think, through design, there have been examples where there is some transparency at the bottom of a washroom, visibility. Obviously, it's important where they are. They need to be in visible places, and so more kind of through design.
Right. Remember when we approved those, that things like the lighting and how long the door would lock for and all those kinds, and how they were washed. On the park board side, going back a long time now, when I was on the park board, the caretakers' cottages, a lot of them have washrooms in them, and there was always a bit of a back and forth about whose responsibility it was and how many hours those would be open and clean and so forth. So the park board is already on board with this kind of work. I mean, they have a lot of opportunity for public space for washrooms. Are they part of this ongoing work?
Yes, exactly. So we work closely with any washrooms in parks. We work closely with the park board. They also have a map of washrooms already on their web page. We have mixed bag of old model where caretakers still do that work, as well as park operations would look after. But that is ongoing challenge, like somebody mentioned it, that's life, part of the life, and we are dealing with it.
Well, it feels to me like it sounds like that's still an opportunity that's not fully taken advantage of. So I don't know, I don't know whether Councillor Ball intended this to be also intended for the park board. Thank you. And then the third piece is TransLink. I've always been concerned that TransLink didn't incorporate public washrooms into their train stations when they were built. Is that something we have an ongoing conversation about?
I would hope so. I'm afraid that's not part of my expertise, but there might be opportunity to actually review, because we as city provide building permits and occupancy permits to all these entities, so that might be an opportunity to look into that a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. And if we could also include the Active Transportation Policy Council in this work, because a lot of people who are pedestrians spend a lot of time out on the street on their feet and would also be interested in this work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Deal. Councillor DiGenova.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions. I'm actually very happy that Councillor Deal had asked that question about parks, because my next question leads into that. And as many councillors here wear other hats and, work in other professions, accessible housing is a profession that I work in. I very closely with persons with disabilities, and understanding that actually to build an accessible washroom, it doesn't cost much more than it does to build a standard washroom. So I have a question regarding sort of looking at the accessibility in a holistic way. So for example, I was asked to come and tour a laneway house that had an accessible washroom. But the laneway house wasn't accessible because the city standard was to build a lip, and you can't build the laneway house without a lip over the door. So if you can't get into the laneway house, I'm not sure how you're going to use the accessible washroom. So these are some of the issues. It's like parks. Many of the parks that have these field houses, although I understand under the last government, many of them were transitioned into artist spaces. So those washrooms, if people are living there, would be for the private residents there, are parks the most accessible places? Community centers are one thing, but in parks, there's many parks that people with disabilities or seniors might not frequent, especially year-round. So in looking at sort of accessibility as a whole, have we defined where there's a need for public washrooms at no cost? The downtown east side is great, but is there a need in other areas, and have staff identified any of those areas?
Well, I can speak to, again, to buildings. New ones are non-issue because its requirement is happening naturally as we develop new ones, same with renovations. We are, however, making significant efforts on going back and retrofitting existing ones, and we are working with Spark and Rick Hansen Foundation. We have already done work over the last 2 years and started implementing projects. But as you say, it's not only washrooms, it's the whole access. It's basically that person needs from their home to go from point A to point B to point C, and everything needs to be accessible. Otherwise, no point of having accessible washroom if they can't even reach it. So I would say just really it's relating to good design, and again, in parks, it includes ramps, it includes pathways. It's not just washrooms. So I would say it's much larger issue, and we certainly on staff level are looking at it holistically. We've done many improvements in parks with adding ramps, asphalting pathways, and things like that in order to access the washroom.
Thank you. And I know you've done fantastic work at the Park Board and here at the city. I'm just looking sort of at moving forward also, what is accessible? Because to some people in a manual chair, a washroom may be accessible, but to others, like a high quad in a different type of chair, someone using a sip and puff, there's different levels of accessibility. So I understand the highest is adaptability level 3. Is that something that the City of Vancouver strives for in our accessible washrooms?
Yes, I would say, again, we are looking for ways to go over and above what's regulated. We have seen trends with different chairs, and we are relying on Persons with Disability Committee quite a bit. Together they've done some research and shared with us, and their guidelines that they offered, which we have access to, it's either references some work already done in states, or even their own personal opinions. So we are really trying to gather database with what is changing, and you know, there are widths that are actually seem to be growing a little bit with the more automatic chairs. So yes, I think we expect some change. Not huge amount, but some change, yeah.
Thank you. My last question is regarding public benefit. So an accessible washroom could be seen as a public benefit. Would that be something that's currently encompassed in the city's community amenity contribution guidelines? Would a public washroom be something that a CAC could go towards in a project to have a public washroom nearby a new development? Or is that something that, you know, we often hear applicants are contributing to public benefit strategy or package? Are accessible washrooms included in that nearby?
I would say they already are. You know, maybe focus needs to be made a little bit more clearly, but you know, we get CACs and DCLs for park development, which includes everything that comes in park, including washrooms. We receive those benefits for street and traffic improvements. Again, it could have a public washroom in it and similar, yeah.
Okay, I had a couple questions as well. First one was around the guidelines. So it sounds like we do have guidelines already for public washrooms from the sounds of it.
I would, as I mentioned, I would say for buildings we do. I can speak to engineering on street and plazas, but however, over the last 2 years with Jim Diva Plaza, with Vancouver Art Gallery North Plaza, we are adding automatic accessible public washrooms. So there is certainly more awareness. I don't think they're regulated necessarily on the streets.
Okay, that's helpful. And the word accessibility here seems to be used as a synonym for wheelchair access. So I'm wondering if we take a broader view of accessibility to consider other physical disabilities, having a child with you, having a dog, a cart with stuff if you're living rough.
Certainly, as I mentioned, I think all 3 committees we are working with have slightly different lens. Even within persons with disability, we developed process whereby we have subgroup which we bounce ideas around projects off of, and that subgroup made sure that each view is covered. We are finding maybe, I don't know enough about seniors differences, but within the committee, but within persons with disability as well as LGBTQ, there are slightly different filters that people care about, and we make sure that we hear from everyone. So as an example, persons with disability could be blind person, hard of seeing, could be hard of hearing, hard of moving, and all of the above. So all of these have slightly different issues and focuses.
Okay, that's helpful. And then the second question was just around jurisdiction. Park board, school board, they, as I understand it, do their own capital planning. We may fund one of them, but we don't compel them to do things one way or the other. It's sort of up to them to decide what they want to put in.
I would say school board is obviously very different because it's funded by the province and it's managed by the Vancouver School Board, whereas park board is part of our capital planning process and it's funded through the city. Again, within park board, I would see maybe two streams. One is related to buildings, which we support park board in and work very closely as to what that is. And again, as I said, that world is quite regulated as it is. We are just making extra effort to go back and renovate existing stock. However, when it comes to park development, then park board definitely looks after that side of it.
So we try and avoid telling them what to put in a park development project. We could suggest, but not, I guess technically we could require, but I don't know that there's any history of doing that.
Yes, but I would say that there is much less difference the way we look at things. The park board has done a great amount of work on public washrooms, and they deal with things like seawall where there is no infrastructure, and then we do porta potties every season. So I think the ultimate end goal is same for everyone, regardless if you are on advisory committee, board, or council, or staff.
That's good to hear. All right, thank you very much. That's it for questions from council.
Thank you.
So that brings us to debate. I'm just going to move us to the right queue that we need to be in for that. Councillor Ball, you've introduced your motion. Did you have more that you wanted to say to it?
No, just briefly, I wanted to thank the members of the committee who were able to come here today in spite of rain and deluge, and to thank all of council for their very considered remarks and for their interest and care, and for our staff for the work that they are doing in making sure that public toilets are accessible. You know, it's interesting, I remember when they were talking about the motion, they were wondering whether to add accessible every time you use the word toilet or washroom, or to just use it in the final line. So I think they chose to use it once, but perhaps it's a good idea now that every time we use the term washroom or toilet, we put accessible in front of it, just to make it really clear. So I do appreciate that everybody is really concerned and cares about this issue and understands that it will really benefit everyone, from the mom with kids to the senior to anyone who's disabled, and that it will change our society to be something more compassionate. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ball. Councillor DiGenova.
Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to support this motion, and I think that we can always strive to make sure that we are increasing our accessibility in this city. I feel that, especially being a liaison to the Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee, and also in working in accessible housing and with people with disabilities, things that I perhaps take for granted, like being able to walk upstairs to use a washroom, are very difficult for others, and they may have to travel blocks, they may have to travel a great distance, or actually find their way home to be able to have facilities that I feel should just be a human right. So I think that we have to consider that it is a human right. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the Seniors Advisory Committee, and for Councillor Ball's motion that I feel really does lay out what we need to do, which is consultation, but also to set a benchmark with appropriate design specifications. And if we do that, I think that we could be a leader in this. I mean, there are ways to go beyond adaptability level 3, which right now is seen as the highest standard. And I know for a fact that it does not cost that much more to make a washroom accessible. In fact, it can cost less. So I feel that it's something that we need to move forward with. We need to make a commitment to this, and we need to look at accessibility as a whole. And for people with mobility issues as well, accessibility, really, it's a very broad word. Some people ask me, accessibility, do you mean financially? Do you mean wheelchair accessibility? And I think that the word accessibility means that everyone can have access. And in the city of Vancouver, I know that it is difficult, and I know that there are individuals who are concerned or embarrassed, who perhaps, need to use a washroom or a facility. In fact, a family member of mine used to own a coffee shop, and that family member had no issue with people coming in to use the washroom without purchasing something. But you could see the hesitation because so many other business owners don't offer that to people in the community. So whatever the city can do to compel them, and Ms. McGuinness brought up some excellent ideas and looking at Munich and other cities that are world-class leaders in this, but we won't be having those conversations unless we move forward and we clearly make a commitment to this in moving forward. I think Jim Diva Plaza and the accessible washroom there, that's fantastic. That's fantastic for people in the West End who are on Davie Street. But unless we have an accessible washroom every few blocks in the future, and we're looking forward to this, I don't see us being an inclusive city where we make sure that every citizen can participate. So I know that the Persons with Disabilities Advisory Committee, and I did hear from the chair when I attended our recent working group session last week, that they are very much in support of this motion. And I thank Councillor Ball for bringing something forward that's so important. I think one day, if we're all lucky enough to become seniors, some councillors already are seniors and have noted that, we all may need facilities that are accessible. And I think that some of us who don't have those needs might take that for granted, but we should be looking towards the future here. And I'm more than happy to vote in favor of this and support Councillor Ball's motion. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor DeGenova. I did have a couple of amendments that I was going to put on the floor. The first one, I would say quite broadly supportive of the motion, and the amendments are intended for clarification for staff and knowing that we're not all going to be here forever, so that they understood what we might have meant with it. The first one is in the number 1, which was to add the word accessible public toilets, and I appreciate Councillor Ball's points that one shouldn't need to say that, but I think it helps for sure in terms of understanding the broadness of it. The second piece relates to a couple things. The idea that telling staff that they must include a public toilet in every community planning exercise, I wasn't really sure where that was going, and there's 2 issues there. One is that could lead to many, many years before they come in, because the current community planning, there's only so many communities we plan at any given time, and I wanted communities that aren't in a current or future community planning process like Granby Woodland, which just finished, the opportunity to be able to deploy public toilets as soon as humanly possible. And also recognizing that there are operating costs associated with it. So I think that's what provisions meant, but I wanted to make absolutely clear what it would be looking at. So the second amendment would be to say that they include consideration, staff would include consideration of accessible public toilets in street design projects, which are the direct purview of the city and community planning, so further to the point of current and future planning projects, including the operating costs that would be required for proper maintenance to ensure well-functioning, safe, and accessible public toilets. Okay, so,
Projects was actually not even supposed to be there.
Sorry, let me just figure out how, okay, you've got a microphone, Councillor Ball. Sorry, no, now you do have a microphone. Okay.
Thank you so much. I believe that the most important thing, actually, the word projects had been taken out. I don't know why it's still here, but the most important thing is future planning, because, and if we can get that it's future planning there as well as right now, but it's future planning, because if we don't plan now to have many more when we're talking about bringing all the people into Vancouver, then we've got a real problem. So if we could make sure that
Okay, so
future planning is in there.
so could we put the word future before community planning?
Yep.
I'll just get the clerk to get that in. Okay, and then if nobody has any issues with that, perhaps we'll just vote on the amendments and then we can just stay in the main queue. I will move us to an amendment queue then. Councillor DeGenova.
I was happy to support the amendment. I just, after, Madam Chair, after you spoke, I was a little concerned that, and I was looking for some clarification, because when you introduced your amendment, you had said that this would mean that if community plans had already been planned out, that we would move forward immediately with those washrooms, and that may mean they're not accessible. I was just hoping that you might be able to elaborate on that, because I understood this motion as trying to make every single washroom, every single public washroom accessible. So if your amendment is to move forward without looking at accessibility for washrooms that are currently not built but have been planned, then I'd like to know that, because that may change my support of the amendment.
Well, it sounds like the confusion may have been that you didn't hear what I said, because what you said is not what I said. So perhaps we'll just walk through what the amendment says. So include consideration of accessible public toilets in street design projects. So that would be current street design projects or upcoming or future ones, and future community planning, including the operating costs that would be required for proper maintenance to ensure well-functioning, safe, and accessible public toilets. Does that clarify the matter for you, Councillor DeGenova?
Yes, I'm still concerned about consideration, but that's all right. I'll support it and hope that we'll move forward with accessible washrooms.
Okay, then I will bring us to the voting queue for the amendment. Do you need help, Councillor Lee? Okay, so the amendment is unanimous, so I will move us back to the speaking queue on the main queue. I would just briefly add a couple comments on the motion. I do appreciate the issue that Councillor Ball has raised. I had a woman come in, an older woman who's living rough on the streets, who has a cat, and she uses mall washrooms as her publicly accessible washroom, and was not only kicked out but threatened with police action as a result of having a pet inside of a mall, which right now that's kind of how it works for her. And it was just, I don't want to get fully into the emotion of it, but when you talk about dignity, it certainly did not feel like that was being afforded to her. But I would also say at the other end of the spectrum, you don't need to wait till you're a senior or homeless, or it's not just a issue for persons with disabilities. Having had a small child, they are not super great at holding it under the best of circumstances, and businesses look at terror with you, some businesses, when you try and access a bathroom, even with cash in your hand, if you've got a small child. So I think the more we can make it just universally accessible, the better it will be for residents in our city. Councillor DeGenova.
No, that was a holdover. Now I'm on twice. I don't know why. I tried to click off.
Are you finished?
Yep.
Okay. Councillor Carr.
Thanks, Madam Chair. First of all, may I just thank the members of the Seniors Advisory Committee for preparing this motion and bringing it to Council, and specifically Councillor Ball for bringing it from the committee to Council. I think that it's a very important human rights issue, and I've had many people talk to me with a great deal of concern around the closure of public washrooms, specifically the one at the waterfront station. It seems to come up a lot. And as I say, in relaying my experience earlier in questioning one of the speakers, there is the matter of dignity and a concern for people who, for whatever reason, need to access a public washroom. We're human beings. We need to use washrooms. And there are other cities around the world I've traveled considerably that handle this in an extremely good way. You never have to fear for the access to a washroom. And if you particularly are, well, not particularly, but if you are a traveler, that is a question that comes up. And I have been stopped by tourists asking where the nearest washroom is. So, I think that this is timely. I very much appreciate Councillor Reimer's amendments. I was a bit confused about the second clause in this, be it resolved, in terms of all current and future planning projects, and wondering if that meant every single project of whatever scale. So I'm happy with the language change that has been accepted by Council. I think it makes it more broadly applicable and understandable in terms of directing staff in this regard. So I'm super happy to support this.
Great. We've got Councillor Ball. I'm just going to forward you and bring you back on at the end.
Thank you.
Councillor Stevenson.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, let me say that this is a motion from the Seniors Committee and the subcommittee that worked on it for quite some time, and it's an excellent motion that passed within the Seniors Committee, and then somehow went off into Never Never Land for some time, and no one knew where it went or how it got there or why it didn't go forward to somewhere else. But nevertheless, I know that you kind of kept a sharp eye on it and then brought it forward again. And the subcommittee did a lot of work, and it's a very thorough motion. As was mentioned yesterday, and really it's a no-brainer for us. And it's most important, and I'm pleased to hear some of the additional comments from the chair, particularly around this issue of trying to work with businesses that would mean that you can just walk into a business. I mean, I know when I had my office on Denman Street, we had a lot of people came through because we opened it up, but lots of places don't. And it would be great, as there are in many places in Europe where they do, and I know some of those places are paid to do that, but nevertheless, it's really very, very helpful, and not just for seniors, but also for tourists. Tourists, trying to find a place to go to the washroom can be really intimidating, trying to ask people if you don't speak English well and so on, but if you can just walk into a business, that's a great addition. That's not the answer, but it's an addition. So this really is an important motion, yet a no-brainer for us, and I don't see a problem. I do also want to thank Councillor Ball for bringing this forward for the Seniors Committee, because it had to come forward. And unlike the two motions yesterday, this is the proper place for this motion, and that's why this wasn't referred yesterday, whereas the other two necessarily did need to go back to staff. But this is the proper place, and we've, I think, had a really excellent discussion, and I look forward to being passed. And again, thank Councillor Ball for bringing this forward on behalf of the Seniors Committee.
Thank you, Councillor Stevenson. So, Councillor Ball, I've got another speaker, so I'm just going to bump you up again. Sorry about that. Mayor Robertson.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and I'll echo the thanks to, first of all, the Seniors Committee for their work on this front and advocacy on this really important piece, and thanks to Councillor Ball and Councillor Stevenson as the liaisons. appreciate this coming forward, and a shout out to Councillor George Chow, who was for years on council obsessed with public toilets, and though we didn't make as much progress as I know he would have liked to have seen, and certainly we need to keep focused on this and make sure we improve the situation out there on our streets for accessible public toilets. I think it's important to a lot of people, and I just wanted to add the importance of this and the frequency that this issue is coming up before the TransLink board and Mayor's Council. We get a lot of correspondence, concerns that there are not proper accessible toilets in SkyTrain stations in particular. It's a big concern around the region, and it's considered beyond the scope of what TransLink does. There's been resistance historically in the organization to ensure that there are accessible public toilets at SkyTrain stations in particular, and but it's one that keeps coming up with the board and the Mayor's Council. And I think there's some hope now with the 10-year Mayor's vision and the build out of that plan that there will be some capital available to deal with that and the station upgrades. The question will be around the operating side and trying to figure out how these are maintained, looked after. And that hasn't been a core business for TransLink, but it's certainly on the radar for our new CEO and the governance bodies that there's big room for improvement there. It's just a question remaining as to how TransLink can take that on, and I think advocacy from folks like the Seniors Advisory Committee, that's always helpful. The more people that are raising the concerns, the better, and hopefully we can see some change on that front, make sure we've got accessible public toilets around transit where it's much needed. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor Robertson. Councillor Ball to close.
Yes, thank you. The mayor has pretty well said it all, but I would indeed like to thank everyone who has participated, the subcommittee, the committee, our chair today, and everyone sitting in council who's taken a moment to consider the dignity of the citizens and how we can make a really good change in their lives. So I would like to thank everyone, and I really appreciate the report from staff, the in-depth report from staff, and the offer from our city manager to be able to move this forward. So I'd like to thank everyone and look forward to the vote. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ball. And without needing to extend the meeting, I get to call a vote on this item and then pass it over to Mayor Robertson. Councillors Louis and Meggs, do you need assistance? Okay. Okay, so that means we are 100% in favor of increasing access, to increased accessibility to public washrooms. There we go. And I will adjourn this meeting with much thanks to Council for sticking within the procedural bylaw today. Mayor Robertson.
We will now convene a regular council to deal with the recommendations and actions of today's Standing Committee on Policy and Strategic Priorities. Madam Clerk, may we have the roll call, please?
Mayor Robertson in the chair, Councillor Louis, Councillor Stevenson, Councillor Deal, Councillor Jang, Councillor Reimer, Councillor Meggs, Councillor Ball, Councillor Carr, Councillor Affleck, Councillor DeGenova. You have quorum, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. We need a motion to adopt the Standing Committee's recommendations. Seconder for that too, seconded, and all those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. We need a motion to adjourn this council meeting. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries.
Mayor Robertson.